And, and good morning. Thank you, Katie, for inviting me, and thank you for being here this morning. A rainy morning here in Massachusetts, and it's presidential impact on society through sports. And presidents do have an impact. Now, whether it's direct or indirect, sometimes it's direct, sometimes it's indirect. Like Andrew Johnson, here he is. He's the president of the United States. Lincoln has just been assassinated. And Andrew takes the oath of office, and the Civil War is just about over. And he's got to figure out, how do we mend the differences between the North and South? Where is there some commonality after about 3.5, almost 4 years worth of war? And he decides with his advisors that maybe, just maybe, it's baseball. Why baseball? Because both sides in between battles would play baseball. Not the kind of baseball that you are thinking about today. That's totally entirely different game than the game of the 1860s. Catchers didn't have gloves and caught barehanded and all that. But Johnson's talking to his advisors, and one of the advisors was close to the Washington baseball team. And basically he says this: hey, you know, the Washington Nationals are here, and the Brooklyn Atlantics are also in town, and they're going to play the Washington Nationals. And why don't we invite them down to the White House? And the reason we'll invite them to the White House is unity. There'll be unity. Baseball can unify us. And so Johnson would meet with members of the Washington Nationals and the Brooklyn Atlantics at the White House. It's the first known organized official meeting between the executive branch and the president and the organized baseball team or any sports team at the executive mansion. He figured unity through baseball. Didn't quite work, but they tried to knit the North and South together and figure, hey, this might be a commonality. So Johnson sees baseball, and he likes baseball, and he sees it as an opportunity to unite the country after the Civil War, officially national unity through baseball. Now, Ulysses S. Grant comes after him. He really doesn't do anything with sports, except he does one thing. The kids behind the White House have a baseball field. And I guess Grant wasn't all that busy being the president of the United States. So occasionally he would go behind the White House and he would play baseball. Also, he's running against Horatio Seymour for president in 1868. And according to a book called Baseball in Blue and Gray by a guy by the name of George Kirsch, teams of their supporters once played a game against one another. Again, maybe unity through baseball, but that Grant had nothing to do with that. The Cincinnati Red Stockings were the first, the members of Cincinnati Red Stockings were the first guys to get paid over the table to play baseball in 1869. And Grant brings them to the White House, which was called the President's Mansion in those days. And but he just brings them in just to say hello. I'm not sure it has anything to do with unity, but that starts a tradition of bringing a team in just for the hell of it, because they did something. And Grant would play baseball against the kids. Grover Cleveland, the two-time president, separated in bookends Benjamin Harrison. Doesn't really have time for sports, doesn't have any time for sports. But there he is. He's in this picture. He's greeting members of the Chicago Baseball Club during his first term in office in the 1880s. And but he really didn't have time for sports. As he said, what do you imagine the American people would think of me if I wasted my time going to the ball game? He was not a fan. Theodore Roosevelt, though, was kind of a fan, and he may have saved college football, the version of college football that you see today as it is back in 1905. There were a lot of problems with college football and football in general, more than likely. There was a fatality list of 40 and 22 in 1904 and 18 in 1905. And there was a lot of pressure on a lot of people to get rid of football, including Roosevelt, but nobody could really figure out what could he do. But Theodore Roosevelt threatened to ban football in America unless rules were implemented to make the game safer after a reported 40 players died from injuries suffered on the field over a 2-year period, 1904 and 1905. What was Roosevelt to do? I mean, the sort of professional game was being played in Chicago and being played in the coal mines of West Pennsylvania and also in Virginia. And these were tough guys. And what were they going to do? Send cops to every game that broke out somewhere? But Roosevelt, I guess, felt that, well, if he threatens to ban the game, people would listen to him. Now, the Roosevelt Initiative would eventually lead to the formation of the NCAA. Now, why was Roosevelt so involved? And why did he bring the presidents of Yale, Harvard, and Princeton, Charles Eliot at Harvard? And if you read any of Roosevelt's biographies, you know he hated Charles Eliot. And why did they bring him to the Oval Office and tell him to fix the game or else? And nobody ever said what the other or else would be. Well, Roosevelt hated the president of Harvard, Charles Eliot, and they wanted to change football or even ban it. And anything that Eliot wanted, he was against, like the old Groucho Marx, whatever it is, I'm against it. And he was against whatever Charles Eliot wanted to do. Meanwhile, Walter Camp was the guy who put together the initial rules of football back in 1876. And he's still over at Yale, and there's still a dinner, a Walter Camp dinner every February honoring college football players, except it wasn't held this year because of COVID. And he wanted to keep it as is, and Princeton was kind of on the fence. They could go either way. There were cartoonists around the country who did cartoons like this: the 12th Man, Death, the shawl around the guy, the skull and crossbones. If you notice, the football looks like a watermelon, and it was watermelon size. And it says the 12th player at every game, and behind this guy snapping the ball, there are all kinds of players laying on the field. So there was an awareness among the American public at that time that football was highly, highly, highly dangerous. I demand that football change its rules or be abolished. Change the game or forsake it. That was what Roosevelt said. And he also had soft spots for football players. Why? Well, Theodore Roosevelt Jr. played football, high school and up in Harvard. He suffered major injuries. But more importantly, when Roosevelt was the Assistant Secretary of the Navy in 1898, and he went to join the troops down in Puerto Rico and Cuba, and his Rough Riders, his particular regiment, the Rough Riders, the soldiers that went up San Juan Hill with him, listed their occupation as football players, 10 of them. And so he has this soft spot for football players. So he's got his son playing. He's got these guys, the Rough Riders, and he hates Charles Eliot. So that's enough for him to move ahead to say, hey, I want football to stay. I want football to stay. And he gets them in the Oval Office. He bangs the heads together, and they come up with new rules designed to open up the game and make it less dangerous to play. Although, as we've learned in the last dozen years or so with I guess it's BU, and the doctors that there is the CTE that's on the brain that accumulates after so many hits to the head. So maybe it didn't make it less dangerous. But anyway, by 1906 standards, it did. The committee made up of Eliot and Walter Camp and the guy from Princeton, they decided we're going to introduce some legislation, and that would include allowing the forward pass, which Tom Brady in your area did quite well for a lot of years. But back in the day, first down was 1st and 5. And sometimes to get a first down, you just picked up a player and threw him. And, you know, he might land on his head or might have crashed into somebody else and get injured. So you couldn't do that. It was 1st and 10. So they outlawed that anyway. So they moved it from 5 yards to 10 yards, and mass formations and gang tackling were banned. Barack Obama would be the next president to take up the problems of football in 2014. William Howard Taft. William Howard Taft had a bad day at the office. And he didn't do very much, but he had a bad day at the office back in 1910 on April 14th. He goes to throw out the first pitch, becomes the first president to throw out the first pitch opening day in Washington. And he introduces the seventh inning stretch because he's, over 300 pounds. The seats were Fenway Park size seats, not the 23-inch seats in the modern parks. And he was a little uncomfortable, and he gets up and he has to stretch out, and that starts the seventh inning stretch, although he might have done that in Cincinnati in the 1890s. Anyway, he has a bad day at the office. The suffragettes are in town. They're all in town, and they're demonstrating, and they get an audience with Taft at the White House in the Oval Office. And they're basically, well, when are you going to let us vote? When are you going to let us vote? When are you going to let us vote? How come we can't 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 vote? And he's getting increasingly agitated, really, really unhappy, extremely unhappy, more and more agitated. And basically, he tells his office staff, get me out of here. There's a baseball game today. And they call up the Washington baseball team and say, hey, can you fit the president in today? Oh, of course, he can fit the president in today. And so he went to the game to lift his spirits and the staff's spirits and leave the women behind because he didn't want to deal with the women. And two traditions started. This is just an impact on baseball. The president throwing out the first pitch and the seventh inning stretch. And it would take another 7-8 years before women got the right to vote. 1920 presidential election, women could vote in that election. No suffragettes there. Take a look at that crowd. None whatsoever. There is Mrs. Taft there, but it's mostly men, as you can see, because women didn't go to baseball games back then. It was considered beneath ladylike behavior because the players were all ruffians and tough guys, and it wasn't a place for a woman to watch a baseball game. Taft, of course, was a big man. Legend has it he decided to stretch between innings, the seventh inning, because he felt cramped. People watched him. He stood up thinking he was leaving, and he sat down, and they sat down. Sounds like an Orlo Guthrow story. Woodrow Wilson in World War II helped make the Star-Spangled Banner the national anthem. That would not become the national anthem until 1931. And they decided baseball was not essential. The Army General Enoch Crowder convinced Newton Baker, who was the U.S. Secretary of War at the time, that any draft-eligible men employed in non-essential jobs should be forced to choose, enlist to help stateside or risk going to the front lines of Europe. The first guy who enlisted in the Army was the Boston Braves catcher. Braves have been gone 69 years. Hank Gowdy. 1918 World Series was played in September, not October. It was shortened. The American League decided they did not want to play past a certain deadline. The National League owners said, hey, we're going to play. Good thing for the Red Sox, because the Red Sox won the World Series behind the left arm of Babe Ruth, who set a consecutive innings, a scoreless innings record at that point. Last time the Red Sox won the World Series in the 20th century. There is some myth that the American League owners wanted to get out of there because of the Spanish influenza. It had nothing to do with it. That would come a couple of months later. But Wilson saw baseball an opportunity to use baseball for propaganda purposes. There he is. There's Uncle Sam, bat in hand, hat, and all that. And get into the game was the poster. The Committee on Public Information was created by Wilson, and Star-Spangled Banner happened to be played at the Red Sox games during the World Series, and it would expand to other teams, but would really start in Fenway Park in mass level. But Star-Spangled Banner was performed as early as 18 97 in Philadelphia, and then more regularly at the Polo Grounds in New York City beginning in 1918. It was a military song that was basically used in the 1890s at dusk to lower the flag. But this would be the Star-Spangled Banner. It would be a song that would connote patriotism, and that's what Wilson wanted. Oddly enough, the Chicago Cubs, that was the last team that played the Star-Spangled Banner after it became the national anthem in 1931. They were the last team to play it, but they were involved in one of the first games in the 20th century. A military band was on hand game one at Fenway Park, and during the seventh inning stretch, they played an impromptu rendition of the national anthem, and the regular playing of the song was a song at that time, started in Boston in 1918. Herbert Hoover really didn't do very much with sports. In fact, he did one thing. But Hoover, of course, the Depression took place under his watch. And there were problems, as you know. In 1932, Babe Ruth decided he needed a raise from the New York Yankees. There is the Babe, and the Babe is holding a news conference. All the newspapers in New York are there, and they're going back and forth with Babe. And somebody asked a question. He says, the guy says to Babe, "Hey, Babe, I hear you want $80,000 a year, which is more than Hoover." And Babe says, "What the hell does Hoover got to do with this?" Anyway, I had a better year than he did, and he did. There was one thing that Hoover did do, and it was across the entire entertainment industry, baseball, football, and the National Football League was down to 8 teams by this point. Baseball, football, hockey, and Broadway and movies and vaudeville and all. Hoover decided that we needed an amusement tax in 1932. And that was to raise more money for the United States government fighting the Depression. But what it did was actually depress people going to baseball or football or hockey. In those days, really wasn't much basketball here and there, and the movies and Broadway. And it depressed attendance, so it actually did more harm than good for those industries. A few years ago, I was up at Hyde Park, which is about 65 miles north of my house near New York City. So I wanted to talk to Franklin Roosevelt. I had a number of things I needed to talk to Roosevelt about. For instance, I do an Olympics talk. And I wanted to know how come he sent the U.S. Olympic team to Berlin and legitimized the Hitler regime. And I wanted to know, hey, Franklin, you were the first guy on TV in the United States, 1939 World's Fair. You're basically greeting everybody to the World's Fair on TV. And also World War II starts on December 7th, 1941. And why'd you play baseball? I found out the answers. He thought that it was more important for the athletes to compete in the Olympics in Berlin, 1936. And I think I'm doing an Olympics talk for you, so I'll get into that. As far as being on TV, he was a natural with radio and crowds and all that, so that was good. And well, how about December 7th, 1941, a day that will live in infamy. Let's talk about the 36 Olympics first. In 35, the former Assistant Secretary for the United States Navy, Ernest Janke, and Jeremiah Mahoney, who was a judge in the New York area, pushed for an American boycott of the 1936 Berlin Olympics. Janke was an American International Olympic Committee delegate, and he was outraged with the reports of what was going on in Hitler's Germany. And on November 25th, Janke, by the way, was a descendant of German descent. He was a descendant from Germany. His family came from Germany. Anyway, November 25th, 1935, he sends a letter to the IOC president, Count Henri Ballet-Latour, and he floats the idea of let's boycott the 1936 Olympics. Mahoney said, let's drop out. He was the head of the Amateur Athletic Union, and they were the ones that actually signed the deal to compete in the Berlin Games in 1931 and chose the team. and they just said, hey, let's drop out. And a number of Catholic leaders joined in with Mahoney, and other people, included the New York Governor Al Smith and the Massachusetts Governor James Curley, all calling for a boycott. Roosevelt would have none of that, and the team went to Berlin. The Berlin or Hitler Olympics was politically charged, but Roosevelt urged the American team to go, knowing full well about the strangulation of Jewish rights in Germany. There was no boycott. Marty Glickman, who I worked with in the 1980s, Sam Stoller, who I knew from running the Millrose games, which he did in the 1980s, were there and couldn't compete because the coach said, we don't need you guys. And they put Jesse Owens and Ralph Metcalf instead. And Marty said it was the right decision to go. The wrong decision wasn't letting him run and win the gold medal so he could stick it right in the Fuhrer's face. Pearl Harbor, December 7th, 1941. Roosevelt gets a letter from Kennesaw Mountain Landis, the baseball commissioner. It's called the Green Light Letter. And Landis says, well, what are we supposed to do? I mean, do we just stop here and just wait for the end of the war? What are we supposed to do? And Roosevelt, and this letter is both, well, there's a copy in Cooperstown, and there's also the original in Hyde Park, the Presidential Library. And he said, there will be fewer people unemployed, and everybody will work longer hours and harder than ever before. And that means they ought to have a chance for recreation, for taking their mind off their work even more than before. So play ball. And other sports, Dan Rooney, the president of the Pittsburgh Steelers, the late Dan Rooney, my background includes sports journalism, told me that with that letter that said baseball could play, the National Football League decided to play National Hockey League, whatever basketball was around, which is National Basketball League, golf, tennis, and boxing. Dwight Eisenhower. This is going to be a story about one of your people, Bill Cleary from Boston, Massachusetts, who told me this story at Rockefeller Center skating rink back in 1995, which was the 35th anniversary of the United States Olympic hockey team winning the 1960 gold medal at Squaw Valley. Roosevelt was Eisenhower was looking for a thaw in the Cold War with the Soviet Union. And so was Khrushchev. I mean, they both were looking for something more like Spy vs. Spy from Mad Magazine, so it seemed in some cases. But anyway, in the late 1950s, Eisenhower sends a national hockey team, not a National Hockey League team, although two did go. The Bruins went and the Rangers went, and the Rangers were supplemented by Bobby Hull in one of those tours of Moscow. But it's the U.S. Olympic national team that goes over there. And Bill Cleary, who went to, I think, Harvard. Bill Cleary went to Harvard. It's 1995. I'm with my son. We're at Rockefeller Center, and there's a celebration of the 1960 Olympic team and the 1980 Olympic team. Jim Craig was there too. And Bill says to me, hey, did you ever hear the story about us in Moscow? I said, no. I said, tell me your tale. He said, oh, it was great. He said that there was some sort of program, an exchange program going on between Eisenhower and Khrushchev, and they chose us. So we get up to Boston. Some of us are college students. Some of us are firemen. Almost none of us are ever going to play professionally. In fact, none from that team played professionally that went over. Although Tommy Williams would play, he was part of an Olympics group. So anyway, he says, this is about 1958. He says, so we all get together in Boston and we fly over to the Soviet Union and we land in Moscow and we get taken to the hotel, one of the fancy hotels in Moscow. And the first thing we do is go through the room and start looking around to see if there are any bugs or anything that they want to overhear what we're saying. And so we're looking around, we make sure we talk in code so nobody knows what we're talking about. And then it's time to go down to eat. So we as a team go down to eat, and there's this big banquet hall, and they lead us into the banquet hall and they take us to all the tables, and all the tables, it's a state dinner for them. You got your napkins, you got your knives, you got your forks, you got your spoons, you got your plate, soup bowl. So he sits down and he looks into the soup bowl And what's there? It's a model of the Sputnik, which took off in late 1957. And as he said to me, he said, they were trying to intimidate us. They were the first ones in space. And there is Bill Cleary back in the day when he did travel to Moscow. The initiative would ultimately fail. But it was to remind Americans you couldn't get into space. But America, of course, obviously would get into space eventually after 2 successful launches of the Sputnik. My cousin was Jerry Stiller and Mira, and he told me that they were on the show 36 times, and once they were on with the Moscow Circus. The Americans sent a hockey team and track and field team to Moscow, and they sent the Bolshoi Ballet and the Moscow Circus with the Dancing Bears. And I told my cousin Jerry, I used to love the Dancing Bears and all that other stuff. So they should have sent you and Ann to the Soviet Union. No. I do a TV talk, and I got a lot of Sullivan stories from Jerry when he was on that show. And there is Sputnik, which was no more than a beach ball. I mean, that's what it was, stuffed with 180 pounds worth of electrical equipment. Another one of your guys, JFK. JFK would have two impacts on sports. And one would make the owners a lot of money, and one would be part of a civil rights movement. He was assassinated on November 22nd, 1963, and he leaves this permanent impression on sports. He creates a massive revenue stream for sports owners from television, creates football widows, by the way. Men would be glued to their chairs. They couldn't be moved on Sundays between 1 o'clock and 7 o'clock Eastern time, 1 in the afternoon, 7 at night. And he signs the Sports Broadcast Act of 1961 into law. Kennedy was not responsible for the actual legislation. Could have vetoed it. A Brooklyn, New York congressman by the name of Emanuel Seller, who I believe got there during the time of the War of 1812, 1920 actually, wrote the bill, gets no credit these days for changing the landscape of sports in the United States. What the bill did allowed the National Football League to market its broadcast rights as a league package, evenly spreading the broadcast revenues among the franchises and guaranteeing each team substantial annual revenues. I think Bob Kraft is going to get something like $500 million this year to put into his football team from television. I mean, it's just some ridiculous amount of money. Back in those days, it really wasn't. It was a couple $1 million here and there. And there is Emanuel Seller. He was old. The act would also apply to the National Basketball Association, National Hockey League, other leagues. Major League Sports had an antitrust exemption, so they didn't need the federal law, as the American League and the National League could sell the products as one to TV networks. Pete Rozelle wanted that ability, take all 14 of his teams back in those days and sell it to either NBC or CBS, because those are the only two networks that mattered, and get the most money he could in a bidding war, and he got that. The idea came from the American Football League, which went under the radar, which sold its package, 8 teams, as one to ABC, and got something like $230,000 for the whole package, which wasn't very much, but it was enough for that first year. Kennedy and the NFL Washington team, that's George Preston Marshall. That Washington's team started out up in Boston in 1932, 1933, and moved to Washington for the 1937 season. George Preston Marshall didn't hire Negro players for the Washington NFL team. He was the last holdout in hiring Negro players. Marshall would give in because of a threat by the Kennedy administration to bar Marshall from moving his football team from Griffith Stadium. Oddly enough, Griffith Stadium, Howard University got some of that land that Griffith Stadium was on, to the federally funded DC Stadium in 1962. It's a federal place. You had to have equal opportunity work requirements. The federal government, if you know anything about what goes on in Washington, D.C., major projects have to be approved by the federal government. And the government decided to build a multi-purpose stadium for baseball senators and for Marshall's team. There is JFK and there is Stuart Udall, and the president forced Marshall's hand because his Secretary of the Interior, Stuart Udall, told Marshall, you better obey this legislation which prohibited discrimination in federal facilities, or go find yourself somewhere else to play, hire Negro players. And he would. He would draft Earlie Davis, the running back from Syracuse University, who never played in the National Football League because he died from leukemia, traded him for Bobby Mitchell. Best thing ever for Bobby Mitchell. He became Mr. Football in Washington. Any party, Democrat, Republican, you name it, used to tell Bobby, I said, beat the hell out of staying in Cleveland or being a dentist, which is what he wanted to be. I said, you're right. So Marshall gets a 30-year lease with the federal government, and he gets Davis to shut up the Kennedy administration. Oh, the Celtics ended up at the White House in 1963, probably because Arnold, Red Auerbach, had so many friends in the State Department and the Oval Office, and Kennedy was from Boston and all that. Missing from that picture, nobody's explained it why, is Bill Russell. He is not there, but Satch Sanders is there, and I see Sam Jones and Casey Jones. And of course, Red is there. Buddy LaRue, who is the trainer of the team, they're all there with John F. Kennedy and John Havlicek there as well. I think that's Tommy Heisen behind him. Lyndon Johnson. You would not think that Lyndon Johnson would be creating America's most popular sports event and a quasi-holiday every February. And I know up in your neck of the woods, you kind of celebrated that holiday at least 4 times, 5 times maybe, over the last 20 years or something like that. But it was Lyndon Johnson who put the signature to the legislation that created the Super Bowl. Much of the legwork was done by Emanuel Seller again and 2 Louisiana politicians, the Senator Russell Long and the Congressman Hal Boggs. And the Super Bowl was created in part because Johnson signed the Civil Rights Act into law back on July 7th, 1964. The Super Bowl, the roots can be traced back to a game that was never played, the 1965 American Football League All-Star game in New Orleans. African-American players boycotted that game and set off a series of events that would conclude with the first championship ever between the AFL and the NFL almost 2 years later. And since I am talking to a Boston crowd, I'm going to just throw this in, and it's really nothing to do with Kennedy or Johnson, but the first boycott of an event in New Orleans happened during the preseason of 1961. The Boston Patriots played a preseason game in New Orleans, and Walter Beach, who was part of the Patriots at that time, not much long afterwards, basically told Mike Hollaback and Billy Sullivan, I'm not going to play down there unless I'm part of the team. I'm not going to be subjected to Jim Crow and any of that stuff. And well, they told him, then you don't have to be here. They fired him because he was about ready to organize African-American boycott of that game. So there was a precedent in New Orleans and also Mobile, Alabama. Despite the passage of the Civil Rights Act in 1964, African-American players who were selected to play in New Orleans encountered problems. The players were denied cab rides into New Orleans. They were called names. Cookie Gilchrist, who was with the Buffalo Bills, would lead the charge to boycott, although he got a ride in town because he was accompanied by Jack Kemp, who was white, so he was allowed in the cab. You were an African-American player, you could not get a cab from the airport to New Orleans, Jim Crow. New Orleans never got an AFL team. They were supposed to get one with this All-Star game. But the 2 leagues would merge in 1966, need congressional approval, and New Orleans would become a political football. And Louisiana Congressman Russell Long and rather the Senator Russell Long and the Congressman Hal Boggs, whose daughter was Cokie Roberts, the late Cokie Roberts, both of Louisiana, both were powerful players in the chambers, told that guy there, and I'm behind that guy, Pete Rozelle, the National Football League commissioner. And in those days, I used to wear a tie. I don't know why, but I wore a tie. Hot day in Manhattan that day. That's the USFL, NFL antitrust court action lawsuit in June of 1986. That guy Rozelle tells them, well, we can't give you a team. We're not going to expand. And they tell Rozelle, NFL Commissioner Rozelle, we're not voting for it, and we're going to make sure other people don't vote for it. And Rozelle goes back home, and he tells them, the owners, hey, they say that Long and Hal Boggs say that, hey, the merger won't benefit New Orleans, so they're not voting. We got to do something. And what they ended up doing, the something was that they gave New Orleans a team. So they traded a team for New Orleans, 1967, for their votes and others to vote. And there were maneuvers by Emmanuel Seller that kept the 15 NFL teams and the 9 AFL teams in their cities. There was one proposal to send the Jets and Joe Namath to LA, send the LA Rams to San Diego, send the San Diego Chargers, owned by Barron Hilton, who had business in New Orleans there, and then move Oakland to either Portland or Seattle, the Pacific Northwest. And the reason why they just wanted 24 teams in 24 cities. And Seller said, no, you know what? My constituents go to Jet games. I gave you help once. I can take that help away. And that idea died. The AFL NFL championship game played on January 15th, 1967, the Green Bay Packers and the Kansas City Chiefs. The game was played in Los Angeles. The stadium was 1/3 empty, the last Super Bowl not to sell out. Let me say this about that. Richard Nixon, ping pong diplomacy. Nixon's all over the place in sports during his term. Ping pong diplomacy was a big deal. Nixon goes to China in 1972. But in 1971, the United States table tennis team travels to Red or Communist China. My ninth grade social studies teacher, Stewie Gates, in 1969 made sure, and he's still alive, made sure to tell us it was Red China or Communist China. And this is after there's a challenge to a Chinese squad because of somebody, Glenn Cowan, goes on the bus to say hello. Say hello. Ping pong diplomacy produces a thaw in the United States-Red China relationship. During the 1971 World Table Tennis Championships in Nagoya, Japan, a 19-year-old by the name of Glenn Cowan, who my wife actually knew, from New Rochelle, New York, hopped on a shuttle bus carrying the red-shirted Chinese national team. Zhuang Zhang stepped forward, shook Cowan's hand, speaking to him through an interpreter. Why there was an interpreter there? And when they were told not to talk to anybody, that's a good question that's never been answered. Cowan gets a gift also. There's an interpreter there and there's a gift. And it seems like this is kind of set up, but Cowan claimed he was a self-described hippie, but the hippies ended in 1967. There was actually a funeral in Haight-Ashbury called The Death of the Hippie back on October 6, 1967. And the next day, he gives Chang a shirt, t-shirt, emblazoned with the peace symbol and the Beatles Paul McCartney lyric, Let It Be. Mao shocked the world by inviting them to an all-expense-paid trip to China. After checking with their embassy, the American players accepted. And Nixon said, I was surprised as I was pleased. I never expected the China initiative would come to fruition in the form of a ping pong team. I knew Nixon because Nixon in 1985, I got to know him, was the guy who arbitrated the dispute between the Major League Baseball umpires and the Major League Baseball owners in 1985. On April 14th, the same day that the American players met with Zhou Enlai, Nixon announced that the United States was easing travel bans and trade embargoes against China. The Chinese and American governments would soon open a new back channel of communications with one another. That is Edith Green, Congresswoman from Oregon, got to Congress in 1955. She was the mother of education, among other things, but she was one of the people behind the Title IX legislation that was designed to give women equal opportunity in getting an education with men in American colleges and universities that took federal money. It became a sports bill inadvertently in 1974. No person in the United States shall, on the basis of sex, be excluded from participation in, be denied the benefits of, or subjected to discrimination under any education program or activity receiving federal financial assistance. The battle of Title IX continues. Women's sports is still being fought. Some coaches, some athletic directors crying foul, saying they have to cut men's sports programs and keep women's programs to stay in compliance with Title IX rules. Every woman athlete in the United States, every woman athlete benefited from Nixon signing this legislation. And the odd thing about, he changes the lives of now hundreds of millions of Americans, letting women go to medical school and law school without quotas, and engineers and athletes and all that. And the day he signs the bill into law, which is June 23rd, 1972, doesn't talk about it. Says nothing about it, nothing. Talks about busing, talks about desegregation, doesn't say anything. And with a simple stroke of a pen, Richard Nixon changed the lives of hundreds of millions of American women, plus also women who came to American schools from foreign countries. Nixon was also mad that the Olympics continued in 1972 after the murder of 9 Israeli athletes and 2 Israeli coaches. The massacre, first time that you saw terrorism in your living room. Jim McManus, Jim McKay from ABC's Wide World of Sports did yeoman work. He did a great job describing about what was going on in Munich at the time. Howard Cosell, who I knew, and I'm still friends with his grandsons, Justin and Colin and Jared, who's an ESPN attorney, told me that, hey, it should have been me, not Jim McManus, who did those commentaries from Munich. I don't know why it should have been him, but Howard thought it should have been him. Nixon was very upset, extremely upset, and he sends a telegram to Avery Brundage, the head of the International Olympic Committee, demands the rest of the games be called off, but Brundage gives his talk the next day, 23 or so words to our Israeli friends who perished. The games must go on. And Nixon wants to watch TV. Hey, he's like any other guy. He wants to sit in his underwear and kind of watch his favorite football team, Washington, and his friend, the coach of the Washington team, George Allen, they're playing a playoff game against Green Bay, and he just wants to sit in an office next to the Oval Office himself, maybe have some beer, pretzels, whatever he has, sitting in his underwear so he could scratch himself and nobody would know, and kick the Secret Service people out. Just watch a football game. But he can't, because the NFL has a blackout policy. In 1950, Burt Bell told his owners to black out home games because people won't come to the stadium to buy tickets for home games. They'd sit in front of a television. This happened in 1950 because in 1949, the Los Angeles Rams did a deal with Admiral Television. Remember Admiral TVs, Admiral Televisions? And the deal was, we'll pay you X amount of dollars. You show your games at home, and people will want to buy Admiral televisions. But the attendance dropped by 50%. Your Admiral dealer presents Dick Huffman tackle with the Rams back then. With the Rams 47 through 49. So this would lead, because the attendance would drop, even though they were making money from Admiral, which Admiral was basically the presenter. This would lead to 1950, no, you're not going to do this anymore. All the home games aren't going to be shown. In 1951, the NFL goes to court in Philadelphia. The judge, Alan K. Grimm, in 1953 says, you're cool, you could do this, not a violation of antitrust laws. The problem resurfaces in 1957, the NFL championship game, with the host being Detroit, is blacked out despite being a sellout. So Nixon has nothing to do on Sunday. There he is with George Allen to your right. And there is the guy with the hat and the jacket at the end is one of my favorite people, Marv Levy, who's the only NFL coach ever to graduate to Harvard with a degree in English literature. You over-officious jerk. He once said that, you over-officious jerk. But anyway, so Nixon has nothing to do. You know, he's the president of the United States, but he's going to watch football. Let's do this dragnet style. December 18th, 1972, 2:06 in the afternoon. Richard Nixon meets with Attorney General Richard Kleindienst at the Executive Office building. The reason? I want to watch my friend George Allen's NFL playoff game, but I can't. Nixon wants to intervene because he can't watch the Washington Green Bay game. Can't watch it. It's on Christmas Eve. It's going to be blacked out. The game is sold out. You know, here's the most powerful guy. This is why I don't understand. He's the most powerful guy in the world. And Camp David's not very far. In fact, Camp David's named after his son-in-law, David Eisenhower. They got all kind of satellites and all that other stuff. Why doesn't he just go to Camp David to watch the game in solitude? But he stays and listens to the game. I guess you could watch it at midnight because they used to do that, championship games. We'll show it at midnight. The compromise was reached, allowing blackouts if any game was not sold out within 72 hours of kickoff. Nixon signs the deal in 1973. The 72-hour rule continues to this day. Gerald Ford was a college football player. He was at Michigan University, Gerald Ford. In 1976, he signs a bill helping the NCAA because the NCAA believes in something called principle and amateurism, as long as the amateurs are the players, and looks after athletes by keeping them away from the temptation and professionalism and commercialism. Now, you can't make any money. Right now, Congress is holding hearings on whether college athletes should make money off of their faces. They're doing it right now because July 1st is some sort of deadline that kicks in various states where they get money for selling their faces. So the NCAA is supposed to look after the best interest of student athletes. And the group gets a special tax exempt status as a charitable organization. Billions of dollars flow into the NCAA, but they're a charitable organization under the the Internal Revenue Service Code, as well as Congress and Ford, who signs it into law in 1976. College football teams that appear at bowl games do not have to pay any taxes on their take from the game, neither do their conferences. Jimmy Carter is involved in a whole bunch of things, but the biggest thing is the 1980 U.S. Olympic boycott of the games in Moscow. In 1980, Carter gives an ultimatum to the Soviets: pull your troops out of Afghanistan. They get there Christmas Eve, 1979. By February 20th, or the United States would boycott the Summer Olympics in Moscow. On March 21st, the U.S. pulls out of the Moscow Games. The United States was joined by 60 other countries in the boycott. But prior to the boycott, there was the Winter Olympics in Lake Placid, New York. And that was the first time the USA, USA, USA chant is heard. It was the Friday afternoon. It was when the Americans beat the Soviets, a game that nobody saw live except for those in the Lake Placid Olympics in the United States. It was shown in Canada. So I guess the border cities, if you were in Detroit, Buffalo, Seattle, you could watch the game. Seattle, Billington, Washington, you could watch the games. But USA, 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 USA won. But they did not win the gold medal because of that game. In fact, they had to beat Finland in hope that the Soviets would lose to Czechoslovakia. But if they didn't, they beat them, but they wouldn't score X amount of goals because they could have won the gold medal. Carter would issue a trade embargo on two goods the USSR desperately needed: grain and information technology for computers. He also restricted Soviet fishing in American-controlled waters. The Soviets pulled out of Afghanistan in 1989. The boycott failed. Ronald Reagan did two things that immensely helped the sports industry. One, he socialized cable TV. 1984, Reagan signs into law the Cable TV Act of 1984. It socializes cable TV for those who wanted to watch everything offered on basic expanded tier. Frank Sinatra song, you take all or nothing at all. Consumers bought everything on that tier or you didn't get that tier. There was no choice. The legislation saves ESPN, CNN, Weather Channel, and others from financial ruin. And sports operators start to glom onto this extended tier. Now, I think NESN was already online by this point, so they would get more money. In fact, I know they were online at this point. WSBK tried to become a superstation, Channel 38 at that point, because they thought they could get onto the expanded tier. But anyway, sports operators said, hey, we can make money off of there. And they do. And games migrate from over-the-air TV to cable TV, where teams can get revenue from two sources. One, revenue from cable fees. Two, advertising, which is better than over-the-air TV. I'm only picking Cincinnati. I'm picking on Cincinnati here, but I'm only picking Cincinnati. This could be virtually any city in the United States, with the exception of Boston, because the owners decided, give us tax breaks, give us land, let us build around everything, and we'll build the stadium, because ultimately that stuff like the concert hall going up adjacent to Fenway Park going to make us a lot more money than the baseball stadium. Reagan leaves an enormous impact on sports by putting his signature on the Tax Reform Act in 1986. It opens a loophole in the tax laws, gave owners ammunition in their battles with cities and states to get stadiums. You have a lot of movement in the National Football League in the 1990s. In fact, Bob Kraft almost moved the Patriots to Hartford to get one of these sweetheart deals. And then the Massachusetts legislature came back and said, hey, we'll do this for you. So that took care of that. Reason I put up Cincinnati there is simple. They are one of the cities that they built two stadiums, one for the baseball team, one for the NFL team. Under the right set of circumstances, an owner could get 92 cents out of every dollar generated in a publicly funded stadium or an arena, which they did in Cincinnati. The law gave municipalities a federal tax exemption on bonds to build new stadiums. Cincinnati never got out of the 98 cents that they were allowed to take out of every dollar. It wasn't enough to pay down the debt. So they had to sell off city hospitals, raise property taxes, raise other taxes to find money to pay off the debt on the two stadiums. And there's going to be another negotiations negotiations have actually started between the NFL, Cincinnati Bengals, and the city to see what they could do the next time around. I spoke at the George Bush Presidential Library in 2007. It was a State Department job. And I spoke to 16 foreign nationals and 4 Americans about how the politics of sports business operates. And I have that picture of the library instead of George W. Bush, because George H.W. Bush in 1990 signed the Anabolic Steroids Control Act of 1990 into law. Starting in 1992, the legislation made the possession of steroids without a physician's approval illegal, and there was the whole steroid issue in the 1990s into the 21st century, and that was all straightened out by Congress in 2005. Bill Clinton tried to mediate the baseball strike of 1994. He calls the two sides into the Oval Office, and I could have told him, if he asked me, this is a waste of time, an absolute waste of time. Don Fehr and the players and the owners wouldn't see eye to eye, even if you said to them, the sky is blue, and they looked at it. He tried to hammer out a settlement, failed miserably, but a New York State Supreme Court judge named Sotomayor ended that strike because she found that the owners bargained in bad faith against the players. In 1995, they hammered the New Deal out. And of course, she is now a Supreme Court justice and goes to the same hairdresser as my wife. It's the last time I saw her. They were at the same hairdresser together. He also signed the Curt Flood Act of 1998 into law that gave baseball players the same rights as basketball, football, hockey, and soccer players in negotiations, collective bargaining. George W. Bush, former managing general partner of the Texas Rangers, in 1994, he includes a segment on steroids and athletes using steroids in the State of the Union. And by 2005, Congress would hold hearings on the use of steroids in sports, kind of nudged by Bush to do it and others. And that was, you might remember, Rafael Palmeiro was in front of Congress and Mark McGuire and a whole bunch of others, all kicked off because Jose Canseco was on 60 Minutes saying, hey, this is how it was done in baseball. The Bush administration also provided a good deal of security for the Athens Olympics in 2004 as part of the war on terrorism. Hey, if Barack Obama would have listened to me, he never would have gone to Copenhagen trying to get Chicago the 2016 Olympics because it was wired for Rio. But the International Olympic Committee likes to see leaders like Tony Blair and Putin and Obama genuflect in front of them begging for the Olympics. Obama wants to get the Olympics for Chicago, his adopted home city. And he talked about the International Olympic Committee and his failure. I remember this vividly when Chicago had the bid for the 2016 Olympics. Very effective committee had flown to Copenhagen to make their presentation, and Michelle, his wife, had gone with them. I got a call, I think, before the thing ended, but on fairly short notice, that everyone thought if I flew out there, we'd have a good chance of getting it, and it might be worth essentially just taking a one-day trip. So we fly out. Subsequently, I think we've learned IOC decisions, the International Olympic Committee decisions, are similar to FIFA, who runs the soccer global. It governs the world of soccer. Decisions a little bit cooked. No, Barack, I hate to disagree with you, but it's rather well done. That is why there are court cases around the world looking at bribery, both involving the IOC and FIFA. We didn't make the first cut, despite the fact by every objective metrics, America's bid was the best. The concussion summit in 2014, Barack Obama knew nothing about Franklin Roosevelt's 1905, let's get college football safe. And he has this discussion about concussions and the CTEs and all the ailments that go along, and players, former NFL players committing suicide. And I actually talked to one of them who had a gun in his mouth, who threatened to kill himself, Gene Atkins of New Orleans. And the effects from long-term impact of concussions. And so they have a talk at the White House. They talk about girls' soccer is not particularly good for girls hitting the ball, and cheerleading is not particularly good for concussions and all. And that's it. They have the show of force and nothing else. The concussion issue 7 years later seems to have been swept under the table somehow by the NFL, and you never hear about it, even though there are a whole bunch of former players who are out there who can't function because of playing football. Donald Trump's contribution to sports pledged support for the 2028 Los Angeles Olympics bid. Olympics will be in Los Angeles in 2028. Pledged support for the 2020 World Cup bid by the United States, Canada, and Mexico. Those three countries have soccer's World Cup that year. Pardoned Jack Johnson for being arrested because of the Mann Law, which was done in 1910. Jack Johnson liked white women, and he was African-American, and he was arrested for taking one of his girlfriends across state lines, spent a year in jail, fled to Europe. He finally got a pardon because of the Mann Law. Two other people who were nailed under the Mann Law, Chuck Berry and Charlie Chaplin. Oh, and he criticized NFL and NBA players for their social positions and protesting over the bunch of years, and White House visits by athletes were contentious. Joe Biden still has not decided officially to send or not send athletes to the Tokyo Olympics. Tokyo is still, and it's Tokyo particularly, is still in lockdown. And then he's got the Uyghurs, the 2022 Olympics in China. Should we go or shouldn't we not go because of human rights abuses, particularly the Uyghurs, the Muslims, and should college football players be paid? That right now is being talked about in Congress, and he hasn't come out with a position on that. They have come out in a position that the athletes should go to China, and the G7, I guess, yesterday is supporting going to the Tokyo Olympics at this point, when the Olympics start on July 23rd. Katie, thank you so much for inviting me. Presidential decisions do matter in the sports industry and have had lasting effects, from Andrew Johnson to Teddy Roosevelt to Ronald Reagan to Bill Clinton to Barack Obama to Donald Trump, and probably to Joe Biden when he finally makes his presidential decision. My name is Evan Weiner. Thank you so much. Any questions, any comments?
Evan, this is Mary O'Connor. Before I ask my question, I belong to a lifelong learning program at UMass Boston. I don't know if you'd be interested in speaking to them sometime next year.
Yeah, that would be good. I've done OSHA down in Florida. In fact, I'm doing it this afternoon for them.
Yeah, they would love this. You mentioned Hank Gowdy. He's not any relation to Kurt Gowdy, who was the sportscaster.
No, Kurt Gowdy came from Wyoming.
Oh, Kirk Gowdy from Wyoming.
Yeah, okay, Kirk Gowdy. He was an interesting character. He during the 1968 Super Bowl, there was a writer for Sports Illustrated by the name of Tex Maule, M-A-U-L-E, hated the American Football League, and the Jets going on to beat Baltimore, and they literally are almost get into a fight. He was an AFL guy, even though he's the Red Sox announcer. He was the AFL guy, and he was proud of his league, and he hated the journalism practiced by Tex. So he was about ready to knock him out.
There's so much in this presentation. Would you consider like dividing it like into two groups of presidents? There's so much information.
I could do that because I could go into a lot of detail about the New Orleans thing, because there was Walter Beach, who played with Boston, and then in Mobile, Alabama, there was American Football League teams that played there every year. And the Oakland Raiders, there were 4 players from the Oakland Raiders in 1963, 62 or 63, that decided they were going to boycott. And it had to be 63 because Al Davis got there at 63. And Al supported the guys, told his team, we don't have to play in Mobile, we'll play back in Oakland. And there are some civil rights stances that took place. So a lot of stuff in the 1960s that took place, while the war is going on in Vietnam, Tom Seaver took out a full-page ad in the New York Times saying, if the Mets could win the World Series, then we could leave Vietnam, and all this other stuff. So, you got that back part, and then you got, the modern day era from Kennedy on.
Thank you so much for this. I appreciate it.
Thank you. Thank you, Katie, for inviting me.
All right. Thank you, Evan. Have a great week. Thanks, Mary.
Yeah.
Thanks, Katie.
Yeah, and I'll send you the videotape from this week and last week. This way people can see it. And what do we got next week? We got something next week.
Next week is Title IX.
Oh, yeah. Well, that's another part. I can really go into Title IX with the Nixon thing and how it really, and if you're there watching it next week, you'll see everything about Title IX and Nixon's participation, yet non-participation. So there you go. Anyway, thank you so much, Katie.
Thank you.
And we
Have a good week.
will see you next week.
Sounds good. Thanks, Evan.
Okay, take care. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.